The dust cloud rising from the departing train hadn't even settled when Eleanor Zimmerman realized her carpetbag was still clutched in her hand, and her feet were planted firmly on the wooden platform of Sweetwater, Texas, instead of being tucked beneath a seat heading eastward toward Philadelphia. She stood frozen, watching the last car disappear into the shimmering heat of the August afternoon, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack them open. The whistle's mournful cry echoed across the prairie, and with it went her carefully constructed escape from a life that had crumbled around her like dried clay. "Maybe you weren't meant to go." The voice came from behind her, low and steady, with the kind of certainty that made her spine straighten even as tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. Eleanor turned slowly, her green eyes blinking against the harsh sunlight, and found herself looking at a man who seemed carved from the same rugged landscape that surrounded them. He was tall, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where it touched his collar. His eyes were an unusual shade of amber, like whiskey held up to lamplight, and they studied her with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been concern. "Excuse me." Eleanor's voice came out sharper than she intended, but shock and disappointment had stolen her ability to be polite. She had been so close to leaving everything behind, to starting fresh where nobody knew about the scandal that had destroyed her family's reputation, where nobody whispered about her father's gambling debts and her mother's laudanum dependency that had ended in tragedy 6 months prior. The man gestured toward the tracks with one gloved hand, a slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth that somehow didn't feel mocking. "That train, maybe you weren't meant to be on it." Sometimes fate has a way of keeping us exactly where we need to be, even when we're running hard in the opposite direction. Eleanor wanted to argue, to tell this stranger that he had no right to speak about fate or destiny or whatever philosophical nonsense he was peddling. But the words stuck in her throat because a small, traitorous part of her wondered if he might be right. She had missed the train because she had stopped to help a young mother whose child had dropped a cloth doll in the street, and by the time Eleanor had retrieved it from beneath a wagon wheel and returned it to the sobbing toddler, the conductor had blown his final whistle. She had run, her skirts hiked up in a most unladylike fashion, but the train had already begun moving, and the conductor had shaken his head apologetically as she reached the platform. "I don't believe in fate," Eleanor said finally, adjusting her grip on the carpetbag that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. "I believe in making choices and living with the consequences. And right now the consequence of my choice to help someone is that I'm stranded in a town where I know nobody with barely enough money for a week's room and board." The stranger tipped his hat back slightly, revealing more of his face, and Eleanor noticed a thin scar that ran along his jawline, barely visible against his tanned skin. "Well then, miss, seems to me you've got another choice to make. You can stand here feeling sorry for yourself, or you can let me buy you a cup of coffee at the hotel dining room while you figure out your next move. Name's Austin Bradley, and I promise I'm not in the habit of accosting stranded ladies on train platforms unless they look like they might faint from the heat." Despite everything, Eleanor felt a small laugh bubble up in her chest. It came out sounding slightly hysterical, but it broke the tension that had been building in her shoulders. "Eleanor Zimmerman, and I don't faint. But I suppose coffee couldn't hurt, and I need to secure a room anyway before someone else takes the last available bed in this town." Austin gestured toward the main street of Sweetwater, which stretched out before them in a dusty ribbon lined with wooden buildings that had seen better days, but still maintained a certain frontier charm. The hotel was visible 2 blocks down, a 2-story structure with a covered porch and actual glass windows that suggested it catered to travelers with at least some standards. As they walked, Eleanor became acutely aware of the way people watched them, the way curtains twitched in windows and conversations paused as they passed. She supposed a strange woman arriving alone and then being escorted by Austin Bradley was the kind of gossip that would fuel supper conversations for days in a town this size. "You're known here," Eleanor observed, trying to keep her voice neutral. The last thing she needed was to attach herself to someone with a questionable reputation, not when she was trying to escape one herself. Austin nodded, acknowledging the stares without seeming bothered by them. "I run a cattle operation about 10 miles north of town. Bradley Ranch has been in my family since my grandfather settled here in 1854. My father passed 3 years ago, left me the whole spread. It's a good life, honest work, but it means everyone in Sweetwater knows my business almost before I do myself." They reached the hotel, and Austin held the door open for her, the gesture so natural and courteous that Eleanor felt some of her defensive walls begin to lower. The interior was mercifully cooler than the street, with a large fan rotating slowly from the ceiling and windows that had been opened to catch any hint of a breeze. The lobby was furnished with well-worn but clean furniture, and a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair stood behind the front desk, her sharp eyes taking in Eleanor's appearance with the kind of assessment that could catalog every detail in seconds. "Austin Bradley, what have you brought me today?" the woman asked, her tone suggesting both familiarity and affection. "This wouldn't be that mail-order bride you told me you were sending for, would it?" Eleanor's face flushed hot, and she opened her mouth to correct this outrageous assumption, but Austin beat her to it with a laugh that sounded genuinely amused rather than embarrassed. "Now, Martha, you know I wouldn't order a bride any more than I'd order a horse without seeing it first. This is Miss Eleanor Zimmerman, and she missed her train east. She needs a room for at least tonight, and I figured you'd treat her better than she'd get at the boarding house down the street." Martha's expression softened immediately, and she pulled out her registration book with practiced efficiency. "Of course, dear. I have a lovely room on the second floor, faces east so you get the morning light but stays cool in the afternoon. $2 a night, includes breakfast." "How long will you be staying?" Eleanor set down her carpetbag and reached for her reticule, doing quick calculations in her head. She had $17.30 to her name, which meant she could afford maybe 6 or 7 nights if she was careful about meals. "I'm not entirely sure yet. At least a few days while I determine when the next train east will be passing through." "Next eastbound won't be for 5 days, Martha said as she turned the registration book toward Eleanor. "They only run twice a week through Sweetwater and you just missed today's. Sign here, please." 5 days. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she signed her name, the reality of her situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. 5 days in a strange town with barely enough money to see her through, and then what? Even if she made it to Philadelphia, she had no prospects there beyond a distant cousin who had offered grudging charity in a single terse letter. She had been running toward an uncertain future, and now she was trapped in an equally uncertain present. Austin must have seen something in her face because he gently took her elbow and guided her toward the dining room entrance. "Come on. Coffee first, crisis later. That's always been my philosophy." The dining room was nearly empty at this hour, the lunch crowd having dispersed, and the supper rush still hours away. They settled at a table near a window that overlooked the main street, and a young waitress appeared almost immediately with a pot of coffee and 2 thick ceramic mugs. The coffee was strong and hot, and Eleanor wrapped her hands around the mug gratefully, letting the warmth ground her even though the August heat made it an illogical comfort. Tell me about Philadelphia, Austin said after a long moment of companionable silence. What's waiting for you there? Eleanor considered lying, constructing some pretty fiction about opportunities and family, but something about Austin's steady gaze made dishonesty feel both impossible and unnecessary. Honestly, not much. A cousin I've met exactly twice in my life who offered me a place to stay out of Christian duty rather than affection. My parents are both gone. My father died 18 months ago and my mother followed 6 months later. They left nothing but debts and damaged reputation behind. I thought starting over somewhere far away was my only option. What kind of damaged reputation? Austin asked the question carefully, without judgment, and Eleanor appreciated that more than she could say. My father was a gambler. Not the gentlemanly kind who plays cards at his club, but the desperate kind who bet money he didn't have on horse races and boxing matches, and anything else he thought might restore what he'd already lost. When he died, the creditors descended on us like vultures. My mother couldn't bear it. She had always been fragile, prone to headaches and nervous complaints, and after father passed, she started taking laudanum for the pain. One night she took too much, whether on purpose or by accident, nobody knows for certain. After that, the whispers became unbearable. No decent family would receive me. No respectable man would court me. I was tainted by association. Austin listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful, and when Eleanor finished speaking, he took a long sip of his coffee before responding. Seems to me the only thing you're guilty of is having the misfortune of being born to flawed parents, which is something most of us share in one way or another. My father drank more than he should have and had a temper that made ranch hands quit, rather than endure another one of his rages. But that doesn't define who I am, and your parents' choices don't define who you are either. The kindness in his words made Eleanor's throat tighten with emotion she had been suppressing for months. She blinked rapidly, refusing to cry in front of this stranger no matter how understanding he seemed. That's a generous perspective, Mr. Bradley, but unfortunately society doesn't tend to be so philosophical about these matters. Call me Austin, please. And society in a place like Sweetwater is different than what you're probably used to. People out here are too busy surviving to worry much about who your parents were or what mistakes they made. What matters is whether you pull your weight, whether you keep your word, whether you can be counted on when things get difficult. The past matters less than what you do right now today. Eleanor wanted to believe him, but years of social conditioning made her skeptical. Still, there was something compelling about Austin Bradley that went beyond his handsome features and courteous manner. He had a solidity to him, a groundedness that suggested he was exactly who he appeared to be without hidden agendas or ulterior motives. In Eleanor's experience, such men were rare as diamonds, and she found herself wanting to trust him even as her more cautious nature urged restraint. "What do you suggest I do with these 5 days before the next train?" Eleanor asked, changing the subject slightly. "I can't simply sit in my hotel room waiting for time to pass." Austin leaned back in his chair, studying her with those unusual amber eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Well, that depends. Do you have any skills beyond what a proper lady is typically taught? Can you cook, so keep accounts?" "I can do all 3 reasonably well," Eleanor replied. "My mother insisted on hiring tutors rather than governesses, so I had a fairly comprehensive education. I speak French and German. I can manage household accounts and correspondence. I'm competent with a needle, though I wouldn't call myself an expert seamstress. I can cook basic meals, though nothing fancy. Why do you ask?" "Because Sweetwater could use someone with those skills," Austin said, warming to whatever idea was forming in his mind. "The school teacher, Miss Patterson. She's been talking about retiring and moving to Austin to live with her sister. If she does, we'll need someone to take over the school come fall. And Mrs. Chen, who runs the laundry and does mending for half the town, she mentioned just last week that she's overwhelmed with work and could use someone to help with the sewing. I'm not saying you should give up on Philadelphia, but maybe 5 days is enough time to see if Sweetwater might offer you something worth staying for." The suggestion was both terrifying and strangely appealing. Eleanor had spent so many weeks focused on escape, on running away from shame and loss, that she hadn't considered the possibility of running toward something instead. Could a town like Sweetwater, rough and remote and nothing like the refined society she had been raised in, actually offer her a fresh start? Could she reinvent herself here, become someone new who wasn't defined by scandal and tragedy? "I don't know," Eleanor said slowly. "It seems impulsive to make such a significant decision based on a missed train and a conversation with a stranger, no matter how kind that stranger has been." Austin smiled, and Eleanor noticed the way it transformed his whole face, softening the hard angles and making him look younger. "I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I'm just suggesting you keep your eyes and heart open over the next few days. Talk to people, see what Sweetwater has to offer, and then make your decision about that eastbound train when it arrives. Fair enough?" Before Eleanor could respond, the door to the dining room opened, and a woman strode in with the kind of confidence that suggested she owned every space she entered. She was perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair streaked with silver and shrewd brown eyes that immediately locked onto Austin and Eleanor. She wore a practical split riding skirt and a crisp white blouse, and there was something about her bearing that commanded respect. "Austin Bradley, I heard you were in town," the woman said as she approached their table. Her gaze shifted to Eleanor, curious but not hostile. "And who might this be?" Austin stood immediately, his manners too ingrained to remain seated in the presence of a lady. "Mrs. Violet Harper, this is Miss Eleanor Zimmerman. She arrived on today's train, or rather, she missed leaving on today's train. Eleanor, Mrs. Harper owns the general store and serves on the town council. She knows everything that happens in Sweetwater, usually before it actually happens." Violet Harper laughed, a rich, warm sound that filled the room. "Don't exaggerate, Austin. I just pay attention, which is more than most people bother to do. Miss Zimmerman, are you staying in Sweetwater long?" "At least 5 days," Eleanor replied, standing as well because it felt wrong to remain seated when everyone else was on their feet. "Until the next eastbound train." Violet said, and that single syllable contained volumes of speculation and assessment. "Well, if you find yourself with time on your hands, come by the store. I could always use an intelligent conversation, and I'm curious about what brings a clearly educated young woman to our little corner of Texas." The invitation was unexpected, and Eleanor found herself nodding acceptance before she had consciously decided to do so. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. That's very kind." "Just being neighborly," Violet said with a wave of her hand. "Austin, make sure Miss Zimmerman knows where to find good meals and decent company while she's here. We wouldn't want her first impression of Sweetwater to be poor." With that, Violet swept out of the dining room as dramatically as she had entered, leaving a thoughtful silence in her wake. "She seems formidable," Eleanor observed as they both sat down again. "Violet's the kind of woman who could run an entire town single-handedly if given the chance," Austin agreed. "Her husband died in the war, left her with 2 young daughters and a failing store. She turned that store into the most successful business in Sweetwater through sheer determination and business sense. Her daughters are grown now, married and moved to Dallas, but Violet stayed because this is home." Eleanor filed that information away, intrigued by the idea of a woman not only surviving but thriving in such a challenging environment. Perhaps Sweetwater held more possibilities than she had initially imagined. They finished their coffee while Austin told her about the town, pointing out through the window which buildings housed which businesses, sharing stories about the founding families and the characters who made up Sweetwater's population of roughly 400 souls. When they finally rose to leave, Eleanor felt steadier than she had since watching her train disappear into the distance. Austin walked her back to the hotel lobby, and as they stood near the staircase that led to the guest rooms, he pulled a small card from his vest pocket and handed it to her. "This has directions to my ranch," he said. "If you need anything during your stay here, anything at all, you can leave a message for me at the general store and I'll come into town. I usually make the trip at least twice a week for supplies anyway." Eleanor took the card, her fingers brushing against his for just a moment, and she felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the August heat. "Thank you, Austin. You've been incredibly kind to a complete stranger, and I'm not sure I can adequately express my gratitude." "No gratitude necessary," Austin replied. "Welcome to Sweetwater, Eleanor Zimmerman. Something tells me you're going to find this town more interesting than you expect." He tipped his hat and left, and Eleanor watched him go with a strange mixture of emotions swirling in her chest. She climbed the stairs to her room, unlocked the door with the heavy brass key Martha had given her, and stepped into a space that was simple but clean. The room held a narrow bed with a colorful quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin and pitcher, a small wardrobe, and a single chair positioned near the window. Eleanor set her carpetbag on the bed and moved to the window, looking out over the main street of Sweetwater. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and coral that seemed to set the whole world on fire. She could see people moving about their business, horses tied to hitching posts, a dog trotting purposefully down the middle of the street. It was so different from the structured formality of her previous life, where every movement was governed by rules of propriety, and every interaction was filtered through layers of social expectation. Maybe Austin was right. Maybe she wasn't meant to be on that train. Maybe fate, or chance, or whatever force governed the universe had kept her in Sweetwater for a reason. Eleanor wasn't sure she believed in such things, but she was practical enough to recognize an opportunity when one presented itself. 5 days was enough time to explore possibilities, to see if this rough frontier town might offer her something worth staying for. She unpacked her carpetbag methodically, hanging the few dresses she had brought in the wardrobe, arranging her toiletries on the washstand, placing her mother's silver hairbrush on the small table beside the bed. It was the only thing of value she had kept, the only item that hadn't been sold to pay her father's debts. Looking at it made her chest ache with loss, but it also reminded her that she came from strong women who had survived their own hardships. Her mother might have succumbed to despair in the end, but she had fought for years before surrendering. Eleanor owed it to that memory to fight harder, to survive longer, to build something meaningful from the ashes of her old life. That night, Eleanor ate dinner alone in the hotel dining room, a surprisingly good meal of roasted chicken and vegetables that Martha's husband prepared with obvious skill. She went to bed early, exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the day, and fell asleep to the unfamiliar sounds of a frontier town settling in for the night. The next morning, she woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the distant sound of a rooster crowing, and she dressed with more care than she had in months, choosing a practical day dress in soft blue cotton that was suitable for walking around town. After breakfast, Eleanor decided to accept Violet Harper's invitation to visit the general store. The walk took only a few minutes, and she found the store easily. A large building with a covered porch and a hand-painted sign that read Harper's General Store in bold letters. The interior was a fascinating jumble of goods, with everything from farming equipment to ladies' notions crammed into a space that somehow managed to feel organized despite the abundance. The smell was a complex mixture of leather, spices, dried herbs, and coffee, and Eleanor found it oddly comforting. Violet emerged from behind the counter almost immediately, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing Eleanor. "Miss Zimmerman, I'm so glad you took me up on my invitation. Come, let me show you around, and then we can have some tea in my office and talk properly." The tour was extensive, with Violet pointing out her most popular items and sharing stories about her customers with affection and occasional exasperation. Eleanor learned that the store wasn't just a place of commerce, but a community gathering spot where information was exchanged as readily as goods. By the time they settled in Violet's small office at the back of the store, Eleanor felt she had learned more about Sweetwater in an hour than she could have discovered in weeks of casual observation. "Now then," Violet said as she poured tea from a delicate china pot that seemed incongruous with the rough frontier setting, "tell me your story. Austin Bradley doesn't typically take such an interest in passing travelers, so you must be someone special." Eleanor blushed at the implication, but decided honesty was the best policy. She told Violet everything she had told Austin about her parents' deaths and the scandal that had driven her from her home, about her plan to start over in Philadelphia, and the missed train that had stranded her in Sweetwater. Violet listened without interrupting, her intelligent eyes never leaving Eleanor's face, and when the story was finished, she sat back with a thoughtful expression. "Seems to me you've been dealt a difficult hand," Violet said finally. "But I've found that adversity often reveals our true character in ways that comfort never could. You could have fallen apart when you missed that train, could have dissolved into hysterics or helplessness. Instead, you accepted help from a stranger, secured yourself lodging, and now you're exploring your options. That tells me you have backbone, and backbone is worth more than gold in a place like Sweetwater." "Austin suggested I might find opportunities here," Eleanor said carefully. "He mentioned something about the schoolteacher retiring and Mrs. Chen needing help with sewing." Violet's eyes sparkled with interest. "Did he now? That's Austin Bradley for you, always thinking about what the town needs. He's right on both counts. Millicent Patterson has been teaching our children for 20 years, and she's earned her retirement. We desperately need someone to take over come September, but it's been difficult to attract qualified candidates to such a remote location. And yes, Mrs. Chen is overwhelmed. She's an excellent seamstress, but she's getting older and her hands hurt from arthritis. She needs help but can't afford to pay much, so she's been struggling along on her own." "I'm not sure I'm qualified to be a school teacher," Eleanor admitted. "I have education but no formal training in pedagogy." "Neither did Millicent when she started," Violet replied with a wave of her hand. "She was just a woman who knew how to read and write and had the patience to teach children. The rest she learned as she went. If you're interested, I could arrange for you to meet her. She could explain what the position entails, and you could see the schoolhouse and decide if it's something you might consider." The idea was growing more appealing by the minute, but Eleanor forced herself to be practical. "And what about housing? I can't afford to stay at the hotel indefinitely, and I assume teaching doesn't pay enough for luxury accommodations." "The teacher lives in a small cottage behind the schoolhouse," Violet explained. "It's part of the compensation, along with a modest salary paid quarterly by the town council. It's not much, but it's yours rent-free for as long as you hold the position. As for helping Mrs. Chen, that could provide additional income if you have the skill and the time. Between the two, you'd make enough to live comfortably if not lavishly. Eleanor's mind was racing, calculating possibilities and weighing risks. Stay in Sweetwater and build a new life from scratch, or continue on to Philadelphia and depend on the grudging charity of a distant relation. Put that way, the choice seemed obvious, but fear held her back. Fear of the unknown, fear of making the wrong decision, fear of committing to something that might prove to be another mistake. "I need to think about this," Eleanor said finally. "It's all happening so fast, and I don't want to make a choice I'll regret." "Of course," Violet agreed. "But don't think too long. The eastbound train comes in 5 days, and if you're going to stay, there are preparations to be made. Meet with Millicent, talk to Mrs. Chen. Spend some time walking around Sweetwater and seeing if you can imagine making a life here. And talk to Austin Bradley again. He's a good man, Eleanor, one of the best I know. If he's taken an interest in you, that's not something to dismiss lightly." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm again, but she didn't dispute Violet's observation. There had been something in the way Austin looked at her, a warmth that went beyond simple courtesy or Christian charity. She had noticed it, but hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge it because the idea of romantic entanglement seemed impossibly complicated given her circumstances. Still, she couldn't deny the flutter in her chest when she thought about seeing him again. She left the general store with her head full of possibilities and a promise to return the next day. The rest of the afternoon, Eleanor spent exploring Sweetwater more thoroughly, walking every street and taking note of the businesses and homes that made up the community. She found the schoolhouse easily, a whitewashed building with a bell tower and actual glass windows, surrounded by a yard that had been worn bare by countless small feet. Behind it, just as Violet had described, sat a small cottage with a neat garden and a covered porch. Eleanor stood outside the schoolhouse for a long time, trying to imagine herself as the teacher, responsible for shaping young minds and maintaining order in a classroom full of frontier children who probably had little patience for refinement or formality. It was daunting, but it was also exciting in a way nothing in her previous life had been. There, her future had been mapped out with suffocating predictability. Marry someone suitable, manage a household, raise children, and die having never left an impact beyond her immediate family. Here, she could actually matter to a whole community. That evening, Eleanor ate dinner at a small restaurant near the hotel, and as she walked back, she nearly collided with Austin Bradley, who was leading his horse toward the livery stable. The surprise on his face quickly transformed into pleasure, and he tied his horse to a nearby post before approaching her. "Eleanor," he said, and she liked the way her name sounded in his voice, warm and genuine. "How was your first full day in Sweetwater?" "Educational," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "I had tea with Violet Harper, who gave me a very thorough orientation to the town and its inhabitants. She also mentioned the teaching position and encouraged me to consider staying." Austin's expression brightened considerably. "And are you?" "Considering it, I mean." "I'm thinking about it," Eleanor admitted. "It seems impulsive to append my entire plan based on a few conversations, but at the same time, Philadelphia holds very little actual appeal beyond being somewhere that isn't where I was. Sweetwater offers something more concrete, assuming I'm capable of doing what would be required." "You're capable," Austin said with such certainty that Eleanor almost believed him. "I could see that the moment I met you. You have strength, Eleanor, even if you don't recognize it yourself yet." This town would be lucky to have you." They stood there in the gathering dusk, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, a awareness that went beyond simple attraction, though that was certainly present. Austin Bradley represented something she had never expected to find. A man who saw her as she actually was rather than as society defined her, who valued capability over bloodline, who offered respect rather than judgment. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. "Would you like to see my ranch?" Austin asked suddenly. "I could come by tomorrow morning with a wagon, drive you out there for the day. It would give you a chance to see more of the area beyond the town, and I'd enjoy the company. My housekeeper, Mrs. Delgado, makes the best enchiladas in Texas, and she's always happy to feed visitors." The invitation was improper by every standard Eleanor had been raised with. An unmarried woman did not spend a day alone with an unmarried man at his private residence, not unless she wanted her reputation destroyed. But what reputation did she have to protect? And wasn't that the whole point of starting over, to leave behind those suffocating rules that had governed her old life? "I'd like that," Eleanor heard herself say. "What time should I be ready?" "8 o'clock," Austin replied, his smile widening. "Wear something practical. The roads are dusty, and the ranch is working operation, not a showplace." They said goodnight, and Eleanor returned to her hotel room feeling lighter than she had in months. She lay awake for a long time, watching the moon rise through her window and thinking about choices and chances, and the strange way life could pivot on seemingly insignificant moments. If she hadn't stopped to help that mother and child, she would be halfway to Philadelphia by now. Instead, she was lying in a hotel room in Sweetwater, Texas, contemplating a future she never could have imagined a week ago. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorching August day. Eleanor dressed in her most practical outfit, a brown skirt and cream blouse, and braided her long chestnut hair to keep it off her neck. She was waiting in the hotel lobby at 8 o'clock precisely when Austin arrived with a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 bay horses. He helped her up onto the seat with easy courtesy, and they set off down the main street with Eleanor acutely aware of the curious glances they attracted. The ride to Bradley Ranch took about 45 minutes, and Austin filled the time by pointing out landmarks and sharing more stories about the area's history. Eleanor learned that his grandfather had fought at the Battle of San Jacinto and had been granted land as payment for his service. The ranch had started as a few hundred acres and had grown over the years through careful management and strategic purchases. Now, it encompassed nearly 5,000 acres of grazing land and supported a herd of over 1,000 cattle. "It's a lot of work," Austin admitted as they turned off the main road onto a private track. "We run a crew of about 12 men year-round, more during roundup and branding season. My foreman, Carlos Delgado, has been with the ranch since my father's time. He's married to Rosa, my housekeeper, and they live in one of the cottages on the property. Good people, both of them." The ranch buildings came into view gradually, arranged in a loose cluster around a central yard. The main house was a long, low structure built of adobe and wood, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides and provided shade from the relentless sun. Behind it stood the bunkhouse, several barns and outbuildings, corrals containing horses, and in the distance, the open range where cattle grazed on pale grass. Austin helped Eleanor down from the wagon, and before he could lead her inside, a woman emerged from the house. She was perhaps 50 years old, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a neat bun and warm brown eyes that assessed Eleanor with friendly curiosity. Her face was lined but kind, and she wore a simple dress covered by a spotless apron. "Mrs. Delgado, "This is Miss Eleanor Zimmerman," Austin said. "Eleanor, this is Rosa Delgado, who keeps me fed and prevents the house from falling into complete chaos." Rosa laughed and swatted at Austin playfully before turning to Eleanor with a welcoming smile. "Miss Zimmerman, it is very nice to meet you. Austin told me he was bringing a guest today, and I am happy to prepare lunch for you both. Please, come inside where it is cooler." The interior of the house was a revelation. Eleanor had expected rough frontier accommodations, but instead she found a space that was comfortable and surprisingly refined. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with furniture that showed quality craftsmanship, even if it wasn't fashionable by Eastern standards. Colorful woven rugs covered the wood floors, and the walls held several paintings of landscapes that captured the wild beauty of Texas. Everything was scrupulously clean and well-maintained. Austin showed her around the house, pointing out the kitchen where Rosa worked her culinary magic, the office where he managed ranch business, and the 4 bedrooms that felt empty now that his parents were gone and he lived alone except for the Delgados. There was a melancholy to the space despite its comfort, the sense of a home meant for a family that currently housed only a solitary man. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said honestly as they returned to the main room. "You've built something substantial here, Austin." "My grandfather and father built most of it," Austin corrected. "I'm just trying to maintain what they started and maybe expand it a bit, but it feels incomplete sometimes, like it's waiting for something or someone to make it whole again." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, and Eleanor felt her heart speed up. Was he suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? It seemed impossibly fast, impossibly impulsive, and yet there was something in his eyes that made her think he was deadly serious. Before she could respond, Rosa called them to lunch, and they settled at the large wooden table to eat enchiladas that lived up to Austin's praise, along with rice, beans, and fresh tortillas. The food was delicious, spiced in ways Eleanor had never experienced but immediately loved. As they ate, Carlos Delgado joined them, a lean man with graying hair and eyes that had seen much. He spoke little but listened carefully, and Eleanor could tell he was assessing her just as thoroughly as everyone else in Sweetwater had been. After lunch, Austin took Eleanor on a tour of the ranch proper, showing her the barns where they kept equipment and feed, the corrals where they broke and trained horses, and finally riding out on horseback to see some of the cattle. Eleanor hadn't been on a horse in years, but Austin provided her with a gentle mare and patiently helped her regain her confidence. They rode across land that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, under a sky so vast it made her dizzy, and Eleanor felt something open up inside her chest, some tightness she had been carrying for months finally beginning to release. "This is freedom," she said suddenly, pulling her horse to a stop on a low rise that overlooked a creek lined with cottonwood trees. "This is what I was trying to find by running to Philadelphia, but I didn't even know what I was looking for." Austin reined in beside her, his amber eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her shiver despite the heat. "Freedom is exactly what this land offers if you're brave enough to take it. No society rules, no ancient grudges, no judgments about who your parents were or what mistakes they made. Just you and what you choose to make of your life." "And what would you have me make of my life, Austin Bradley?" Eleanor asked, surprising herself with her boldness. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was low and serious. "I'd have you stay in Sweetwater. Take the teaching position if it suits you, or find some other work if it doesn't. Build a life here where people will value you for who you are, not who you're supposed to be. And I'd like the chance to court you properly, Eleanor, to see if this thing I feel between us is real or just my imagination. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. You've known me 2 days. I've known you long enough to recognize something extraordinary, Austin countered. My grandfather used to say that some people you know instantly, like your soul recognizes theirs from some other life. I never believed him until I saw you standing on that platform, watching your train disappear. Something in me knew, Eleanor. Knew that you were supposed to be here, that you were supposed to meet me, that this was the beginning of something important. It was the most romantic and terrifying thing anyone had ever said to her. Eleanor wanted to dismiss it as fantasy, as the pretty words of a lonely rancher who saw her as a convenient solution to his empty house. But looking into Austin's eyes, she saw only sincerity and a vulnerability that told her he was taking just as big a risk as she was. I'm scared, Eleanor admitted. I'm scared of making another mistake, of trusting the wrong person, of building something that will just collapse like everything else in my life has collapsed. Austin reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. I'm scared too. I'm scared you'll get on that train in 3 days and I'll never see you again. I'm scared I'll lose this chance at something real because I wasn't brave enough to speak plainly. So let's be scared together, Eleanor. Stay in Sweetwater. Give this place a chance. Give me a chance, and if it doesn't work out, if you find yourself unhappy or unfulfilled, you can always leave. But at least you'll know, instead of spending the rest of your life wondering what might have been. Eleanor looked out across the land, at the endless sky and the cattle grazing peacefully, and the creek sparkling in the sunlight. She thought about the closed ending awaiting her in Philadelphia, the life of dependence and charity that offered nothing but safety purchased at the cost of dignity. And then she thought about Sweetwater, about Violet Harper's shrewd kindness and the schoolhouse waiting for a teacher, and this man beside her, who saw her not as damaged goods but as something extraordinary. All right, she said, the words coming out shakier than she intended. I'll stay. I'll meet with Millicent Patterson about the teaching position, and I'll talk to Mrs. Chen about sewing work, and I'll give Sweetwater a chance. I'll give you a chance. But Austin, I need you to understand that I'm not looking for rescue. I need to stand on my own feet, to prove to myself that I can survive without depending on someone else's charity or goodwill. Can you accept that? Austin's smile was brilliant, transforming his whole face with joy. I wouldn't want it any other way. I'm not looking for someone to rescue, Eleanor. I'm looking for a partner, an equal, someone who chooses to be with me because she wants to, not because she needs to. So yes, I accept your terms completely. They rode back to the ranch house hand in hand, and Eleanor felt as though she were floating above the ground rather than riding on it. The decision was made, and instead of the panic she expected to feel, there was only relief and a growing sense of excitement about what lay ahead. When they reached the house, she told Rosa the news, and the housekeeper hugged her with genuine happiness that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. The ride back to Sweetwater that evening was quieter than the morning journey, but the silence was comfortable, full of unspoken understanding and new possibility. When Austin helped Eleanor down from the wagon in front of the hotel, he held her hands a moment longer than necessary. I'll come into town tomorrow, he said. We can go together to meet Millicent and see about getting everything arranged for you to take over the teaching position. And Eleanor, thank you for giving this place a chance. Thank you for giving me a chance. Eleanor squeezed his hands and then released them, very aware of the people watching from windows and doorways. Let them watch, she thought. Let them talk. She was done living her life according to other people's expectations. Thank you for convincing me to stay. For seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. She went upstairs to her room and immediately sat down to write a letter to her cousin in Philadelphia, explaining that her plans had changed and she would not be coming after all. It felt liberating to write those words, to formally close that door and open another one. She sealed the letter and addressed it, and the next morning she posted it at the general store where Violet greeted her with a knowing smile. "I heard you're staying," Violet said without preamble. "The whole town is buzzing with the news. You and Austin Bradley riding out to his ranch unchaperoned, holding hands when you returned. Scandalous behavior, Miss Zimmerman." But there was no censure in Violet's voice, only amusement and approval. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm but refused to apologize. "I'm staying," she confirmed. "Austin is helping me arrange a meeting with Miss Patterson today about the teaching position." "Excellent," Violet declared. "We need young blood in this town, people with energy and ideas." "You'll be good for Sweetwater, Eleanor, and I suspect Sweetwater will be good for you." The meeting with Millicent Patterson happened that afternoon in the schoolhouse. The elderly teacher was a thin woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner, but she warmed up considerably as Eleanor answered her questions about education and teaching philosophy. They discussed curriculum and discipline, the challenges of teaching children with vastly different skill levels in a single classroom, and the reality of frontier education where some students would attend irregularly because they were needed for farm or ranch work. "You'll do fine," Millicent pronounced after an hour of conversation. "You have education, which is essential, but more importantly, you have genuine interest in the children's welfare. That matters more than any pedagogical theory. The town council meets next Tuesday evening. I'll recommend you for the position, and unless someone has serious objections, which I don't anticipate, you can start preparing to take over when school resumes in September." Eleanor walked through the schoolhouse with new eyes, imagining herself standing at the front of the classroom, writing lessons on the blackboard, helping children sound out difficult words or work through arithmetic problems. The cottage behind the school was small but charming, with one bedroom, a kitchen, a sitting area, and that precious covered porch. It needed cleaning and some minor repairs, but Rosa Delgado had already offered to help get it ready, and Austin had promised to handle any maintenance issues. Over the next 2 days, Eleanor met with Mrs. Chen, a tiny Chinese woman with arthritis-gnarled hands and a sharp mind for business. They discussed sewing work, and Eleanor demonstrated her skills by hemming a dress and repairing a torn shirt. Mrs. Chen was impressed enough to offer Eleanor steady work at fair wages, with the understanding that teaching would take priority once school began. The town council meeting was held in the back room of Violet's store, and Eleanor attended nervously, wearing her best dress and clutching her hands together to keep them from shaking. The council consisted of 5 members, including Violet, and they questioned Eleanor thoroughly but fairly about her qualifications and her reasons for wanting to stay in Sweetwater. When they finally voted unanimously to offer her the teaching position, Eleanor felt tears of relief and gratitude prick her eyes. Austin was waiting outside after the meeting, and when Eleanor emerged with news of her appointment, he picked her up and spun her around in a most undignified manner that made her laugh with pure joy. They walked through Sweetwater arm in arm that night, and Eleanor felt the curious stares transform into something more accepting, more welcoming. She was becoming part of the community rather than an outsider, and the feeling was intoxicating. The courtship that developed between Eleanor and Austin over the following weeks was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced in her previous life. There were no formal calls in stuffy parlors, no chaperones monitoring every word and glance, no rigid rules about appropriate behavior. Instead, there were long rides across the ranch land, picnics by the creek, evenings sitting on the porch of her cottage talking about everything and nothing until the stars filled the sky. Austin was different from the men Eleanor had known before. He was direct and honest, unafraid to speak his feelings or admit uncertainty. He treated her as an intellectual equal, asking her opinions on ranch management and town matters, discussing books they had both read, debating politics and philosophy. But he was also tender in ways that made her heart ache, bringing her wildflowers he had picked on his morning rides, helping her move furniture in the cottage, sitting patiently while she practiced her teaching lessons on him. They were falling in love, and Eleanor recognized it even though it terrified her. This was not the superficial attraction of her youth, based on appearance and social standing. This was something deeper and more substantial, built on respect and genuine affection, and a growing sense that they fit together in some fundamental way. September arrived, and with it came the start of the school year. Eleanor's first day as teacher was chaotic and exhausting, and absolutely wonderful. Her students ranged from 6-year-old beginners to 14-year-old boys who were nearly as tall as she was. They tested her boundaries, questioned her authority, and demanded every ounce of patience and creativity she possessed. But they also responded to her genuine care, her willingness to adapt lessons to their interests, her refusal to give up on even the most challenging student. Austin came to the schoolhouse that first evening to find Eleanor collapsed at her desk, exhausted but exhilarated. He listened to her recount every detail of the day, celebrating her successes and helping her solve the challenges. When she finally wound down, he took her hands and pulled her to her feet. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "You're exactly what this town needed, Eleanor. What I needed." The kiss that followed was their first, and it was sweet and tender and full of promise. Eleanor melted into it, letting herself feel the full force of her emotions without fear or reservation. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Austin rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other 2 months, but I can't imagine my life without you in it. Marry me, Eleanor, and let's build something real together." Eleanor knew she should be cautious, should ask for more time, should protect herself against potential heartbreak. But looking into Austin's eyes, she saw nothing but love and certainty, and she realized that sometimes the brave choice wasn't the safe one. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding took place in late October after the harvest was in and the weather had cooled slightly. Violet helped Eleanor sew a dress of ivory silk that had been ordered special from Dallas, and Rosa filled the small church with wildflowers and candles. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, eager to celebrate the union of their new teacher and one of their most respected ranchers. Eleanor walked down the aisle alone with no father to give her away, but she didn't feel the lack. She was giving herself away, making her own choice, and that felt more meaningful than any tradition. Austin waited at the altar in his best suit, his amber eyes bright with emotion, and when he took her hand, Eleanor felt every piece of her broken past click into place, transforming into something whole and beautiful. The preacher spoke about love and commitment, about building a life together through good times and bad, and Eleanor listened with her whole heart. When the time came to exchange vows, she spoke hers clearly and firmly, promising to love and honor Austin for all the days of her life. His vows were equally sincere, his voice steady despite the tears shining in his eyes. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared, and Austin kissed Eleanor with such tenderness that she felt her knees weaken. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, and they walked back down the aisle as Mr. and Mrs. Austin Bradley, ready to face whatever the future held together. The reception was held at the Bradley Ranch, with long tables set up in the yard and food contributed by every family in Sweetwater. There was music and dancing, laughter and storytelling, and a sense of community celebration that made Eleanor's heart swell. Violet pulled her aside at one point, hugging her tightly. "You've done well, Eleanor Bradley," Violet said. "You took a chance on Sweetwater and on Austin, and look what you've built. I'm proud to call you friend." As the sun set and the stars emerged, Austin and Eleanor slipped away from the celebration to the house that was now truly theirs. They stood on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, looking out at the land that stretched endlessly before them. "You ever regret it?" Austin asked quietly. "Missing that train, staying here instead of going to Philadelphia?" Eleanor thought about the woman she had been that August day, standing on the platform watching her escape disappear into the distance. She had been broken and afraid, running away from shame and loss with no real hope for the future. Now she was strong and confident, rooted in a community that valued her, married to a man who saw her true worth. The transformation was so complete it almost seemed impossible. "Not for a single second," Eleanor replied honestly. "Maybe you were right, Austin. Maybe I wasn't meant to go. Maybe I was always supposed to end up exactly here with you." They went inside together, closing the door on their wedding day and opening the door to their married life. The months that followed were full of adjustment and learning as they figured out how to merge their lives completely. Eleanor continued teaching, loving her students and taking deep satisfaction in watching them learn and grow. Austin ran his ranch with skill and dedication, expanding the herd and improving the breeding stock. But beyond their individual pursuits, they built something together. They transformed the ranch house into a true home, filling it with laughter and conversation and love. They hosted dinners for friends, contributed to town improvements, and became pillars of the Sweetwater community. Eleanor joined the Ladies' Aid Society and organized fundraisers for the school. Austin served on the town council alongside Violet, helping make decisions that shaped the town's future. In late spring, nearly a year after Eleanor had missed her train, she discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and wonder, though Eleanor was also nervous about balancing motherhood with her teaching responsibilities. Violet and the town council solved that problem by hiring an assistant teacher, a young woman from Austin who was eager for the opportunity, who could take over Eleanor's duties once the baby arrived. Their son was born in December, a cold, clear night when the stars seemed close enough to touch. Eleanor labored for hours with Rosa and the town doctor attending, and when Austin was finally allowed into the room to meet his child, he wept openly at the sight of Eleanor holding their tiny son. They named him Henry, after Austin's grandfather who had first settled the land, and from the moment he entered the world he was loved beyond measure. Eleanor had worried she might not know how to be a good mother given her own mother's struggles, but she found that love created its own instruction manual. She nursed Henry and sang to him, watched him grow from helpless infant to curious baby, and marveled at the perfection of his tiny fingers and the intelligence already visible in his eyes. When Henry was 6 months old, Eleanor returned to teaching part-time, bringing him to school with her where he napped in a basket and charmed her students with his gummy smiles. Life found a rhythm that felt sustainable and satisfying, with work and family and community all balanced in ways that brought fulfillment rather than exhaustion. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family. They named her Rose after Rosa Delgado, who had become like family to them both. Rose had Eleanor's green eyes and Austin's dark hair, and she was fierce and fearless from the day she was born. Where Henry was contemplative and gentle, Rose was all energy and determination, and together they filled the ranch house with chaos and joy. The years passed with surprising speed. Eleanor watched her students grow up and graduate, saw some of them leave Sweetwater for opportunities elsewhere while others stayed to build their own lives in the town. She took pride in knowing she had given them tools they could use no matter where life took them. Austin expanded the ranch until it was one of the largest and most successful in the region, but he never let business consume him. He made time for his children, teaching Henry to ride and rope and manage cattle, letting Rose tag along on ranch work even though convention said such things weren't appropriate for girls. He made time for Eleanor, courting her still with the same attentiveness he had shown in their early days, bringing her flowers and stealing kisses, and telling her he loved her every single day. When Eleanor was 35, she stepped down from full-time teaching to focus on her family and the community projects that had become her passion. She had taught an entire generation of Sweetwater children, and she felt satisfied with that contribution. The assistant teacher took over as head teacher, and Eleanor served on the school board instead, helping guide policy and hire new staff as the town continued to grow. By the time Eleanor was 40, Sweetwater had nearly tripled in population. The railroad stopped there regularly now, and new businesses had sprung up to serve the growing community. Eleanor and Austin were considered founding figures, respected and beloved by old-timers and newcomers alike. They had built not just a family but a legacy, and they had done it together. Henry grew into a thoughtful young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. And when he turned 21, Austin made him a full partner in the operation. Rose, independent and brilliant, surprised everyone by announcing her intention to attend Teachers College in Austin, carrying on her mother's legacy in education. Eleanor and Austin supported both their children's choices, proud of the people they had become. On a warm August evening, 30 years after Eleanor had watched her train pull away and heard Austin say those fateful words, they sat together on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and scarlet. Their hair had threads of silver now, and their faces carried the lines of years well lived, but the love between them burned as bright as ever. "You ever think about that day?" Austin asked, his hand finding Eleanor's as naturally as breathing. "The day you missed your train." Eleanor smiled, thinking about the frightened woman she had been, broken and alone with no real hope for the future. She thought about all the years since, the life she had built through courage and choice and the willingness to take a chance on something uncertain. She thought about her children and grandchildren, about the community she had helped shape, about the man beside her who had seen her true worth when she couldn't see it herself. "Every day," Eleanor replied honestly. "And every day I thank God or fate or whatever force kept me in Sweetwater." "You were right, Austin. I wasn't meant to go. I was meant to be exactly here, exactly where I am. This is my home, you are my home, and I wouldn't change a single moment of it." Austin raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. 30 years, he marveled. 30 years of waking up beside you, of building this life together, of watching our children grow, of growing old alongside you. It's been the greatest adventure of my life, Eleanor Bradley. "Mine too," Eleanor agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Mine too." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, one by one, in the vast Texas sky. Behind them, through the open windows, they could hear Rosa moving about the kitchen preparing supper, could hear the distant sounds of ranch hands finishing their work for the day, could hear the normal, peaceful sounds of home. Henry would be arriving tomorrow with his wife and their 2 young children, and Rose was due to visit next week during her break from teaching. The house would be full again, full of love and laughter and life. Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself feel the fullness of her contentment. She had started over with nothing but a carpetbag and broken dreams, and she had built something extraordinary. Not because she had been rescued or saved, but because she had chosen to be brave, to take a chance, to believe that maybe the universe had plans that were better than her own. The train she had missed all those years ago had been carrying her toward safety, but also toward a half-life of dependence and diminished dreams. Missing, it had seemed like disaster at the time, but it had actually been the greatest blessing of her life. It had brought her to Austin, to Sweetwater, to this porch and this moment and this deep satisfaction with the life she had chosen. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly. Austin stirred beside her. "For what?" "For seeing me that day. For saying exactly what I needed to hear. For giving me a reason to stay, and a reason to believe I could build something beautiful from the ruins of my old life. For loving me so well for so long. For everything, Austin. Thank you for everything." He pulled her closer, and she felt the steady beating of his heart against her cheek. "The pleasure has been entirely mine, Mrs. Bradley. Entirely mine." They remained on the porch until full dark, wrapped in each other and in the peace of their shared life. Inside, Rosa called them to supper, and they rose together, still holding hands after 3 decades of marriage, and walked into the warm light of their home. Behind them, the Texas night stretched out vast and beautiful, full of stars and possibilities, just as it had been on that long-ago August day when a missed train had changed everything. Eleanor Bradley fell asleep that night in her husband's arms, in the house they had built together, on the land they had made prosperous through hard work and dedication. And her last thought before sleep claimed her was that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The train had left without her, but she had found something infinitely better than escape. She had found home, found love, found herself, and found a future more wonderful than any she could have imagined standing on that platform watching her carefully laid plans disappear into the distance. Sometimes, Eleanor reflected in those drowsy moments between waking and sleep, the greatest blessings come disguised as disasters. Sometimes missing the train is the best thing that can possibly happen. Sometimes a cowboy's casual observation contains more wisdom than years of careful planning. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, you get the chance to build something real and lasting and true that transforms not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. She had been Eleanor Zimmerman, a broken woman running from shame and loss. Now she was Eleanor Bradley, beloved wife and mother, respected teacher and community leader, a woman who had taken her second chance and made it count. The transformation had required courage and faith and hard work, but it had been worth every moment of uncertainty and fear. She had become someone she could be proud of, and she had done it by staying instead of running, by choosing love instead of safety, by believing a cowboy who told her she wasn't meant to go. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor smiled, her hand clasped in Austin's, their breathing synchronized after years of sharing the same bed and the same life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, as every day did, but they would face it together as they had faced everything for 3 decades. That was the gift of the missed train, the blessing disguised as disaster. Not just Austin himself, though he was gift enough, but the opportunity to discover her own strength, to build a life on her own terms, to love and be loved with a depth and authenticity she had never imagined possible in her old, carefully circumscribed world. The house settled into sleep around them, full of memories and dreams and the solid reality of a life well lived. Outside, the Texas night sang its ancient song, unchanged by the passage of years or the small human dramas played out beneath its vast canopy. But for Eleanor Bradley, everything had changed on that August day 30 years ago when she watched her train pull away and heard a cowboy say maybe she wasn't meant to go. Everything had changed, and she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for it. Years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm that characterizes a life built on love and purpose. Eleanor and Austin grew old together with the kind of grace that comes from deep contentment. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, mourned the loss of old friends like Violet Harper, who passed peacefully in her sleep at 82, and welcomed new life as their grandchildren grew, and eventually gave them great-grandchildren. The ranch prospered under Henry's management, incorporating new techniques while maintaining the careful stewardship that had always been the Bradley way. Rose became a renowned educator in her own right, eventually returning to Sweetwater to serve as the principal of a much-expanded school system. Both children married well and built happy lives, carrying forward the values their parents had instilled through example rather than lecture. Eleanor never stopped being grateful for the twist of fate that had kept her in Sweetwater. Even in her 70s, when her joints ached and her eyesight dimmed, she would sometimes stand on the platform of the Sweetwater train station and remember that August day when everything changed. She would think about the frightened woman she had been, and she would marvel at how much strength she had discovered within herself when given the chance. Austin remained devoted until his last breath, loving Eleanor with the same intensity at 80 as he had at 30. When he finally passed at 86, after a short illness that gave them time to say proper goodbyes, Eleanor held his hand and told him he had been the greatest gift of her life. He smiled and told her the feeling was entirely mutual, and then he closed his eyes and slipped away peacefully with his family surrounding him. Eleanor lived 2 years beyond Austin, long enough to see another generation of Sweetwater children start their education in the school system she had helped build, long enough to hold her first great-great-grandchild, long enough to feel satisfied that everything she had started would continue after she was gone. When her own time came, she went the same way Austin had, peacefully and surrounded by love, in the house they had built together on the land that had become home. At her funeral, the church overflowed with people whose lives she had touched, students she had taught who were now grandparents themselves, community members who remembered her kindness and her strength, family who carried her legacy forward. They told stories about Eleanor Bradley, about her courage and wisdom, about how she had helped build Sweetwater into the thriving town it had become. But the story they told most often was the one about the missed train, about how she had watched it pull away without her, and how a cowboy had told her maybe she wasn't meant to go. Because that story, more than any other, captured the essence of who Eleanor Bradley had been. A woman brave enough to see disaster as opportunity, to trust in possibility over certainty, to build something beautiful from the ashes of loss. A woman who had shown an entire community that starting over wasn't about running from the past, but about choosing a different future. A woman who had loved deeply and lived fully and left the world better than she found it. They buried Eleanor beside Austin on a hillside overlooking the ranch, in the land they had both loved. The funeral was well attended, but eventually the mourners dispersed and life in Sweetwater continued its steady rhythm. The Bradley family maintained the ranch, and Eleanor's descendants continued to shape the community she had helped build. The school she had taught in for so many years was eventually renamed the Eleanor Bradley Elementary School, a tribute to the woman who had given Sweetwater's children not just education but inspiration. And sometimes, when new arrivals to Sweetwater asked about the town's history, old-timers would tell them about Eleanor Bradley, who had missed a train one August day in 1876 and had stayed to build an extraordinary life. They would tell about how a cowboy named Austin Bradley had spoken words that changed everything. Words that reminded her that sometimes what looks like the end is actually the beginning. They would tell the story of a love that had transformed not just two people, but an entire community, proving that the best things in life often come when we're brave enough to let go of our plans and embrace the unexpected. The story of Eleanor and Austin Bradley became part of Sweetwater's mythology, a reminder that second chances are real and that courage is rewarded, and that love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. It was a story that gave hope to anyone who felt lost or broken or alone, a story that promised that missing the train might be exactly what you need to find your true destination. And on warm August evenings, when the sun painted the Texas sky in shades of gold and scarlet, when families gathered on porches, and the peaceful sounds of home filled the air, the spirit of Eleanor and Austin Bradley seemed to linger in Sweetwater still. In the school that bore her name, in the ranch that still operated under family management, in the values of courage and community that shaped the town's character. They were gone but not forgotten, their love story a testament to the transformative power of taking chances and trusting in fate and choosing love over fear. The train station in Sweetwater saw thousands of arrivals and departures over the years that followed, but none quite as consequential as the train Eleanor Zimmerman didn't board on that August day in 1876. That missed train had set in motion a chain of events that had enriched countless lives and built something lasting and beautiful. It had proven that sometimes the cowboy is right, sometimes you really aren't meant to go, and sometimes staying is the bravest and best choice you could possibly make. The end.